Well, welcome everyone. I think this is our first major event for the fall semester, and I'm really so glad you could join us this evening. I know people still prefer to be on Zoom rather than in person, but we're not Zooming it. So if people don't show, they're going to miss out. And I think it's important for us to have this conversation in person. We are taping and we will post, but the conversation will be here in this room. I hope you all know you're here to discuss advancing racial equity in New York City. And we're going to be having a conversation about the ballot proposals, 3 ballot proposals that will be on the ballot in New York City this November. And the event is sponsored by the Urban and Social Policy Concentration, student organization CiVEC, and SSOC. We're really happy to have both of these student organizations co-sponsor. And of course, most importantly, the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. Without them, we wouldn't be having this event this evening. I really want to personally thank Jennifer Jones Austin for being an incredible leader in this field. You'll hear more about her from Mayor Nutter and her very, very important work in the field of promoting racial equity. She's one of the few people, I just have to say this, Jennifer, she just doesn't just talk. She's here doing this work, but she really walks the walk. She doesn't just talk the talk. And I just feel very fortunate to have gotten to know her and to work with her over the years. And she's always there for all of you and for the entire city of New York. And it's a blessing to have you in New York City. I know Mayor Nutter would have loved to have you when he was mayor of Philadelphia. Just a quick word. And before I start, I just want to thank Kevin Gully and Jessica and Rachel and all the students who worked hard to promote and make sure we could have an event this evening. It's really important at the university that we have events that students are interested in too, and not that we create events at the top. So I'm really appreciating that partnership with student organizations to get these kinds of conversations going. So I know this is a really complicated political season we're in now. We're all focused on the midterm elections and what every pundit and political scientist is saying is a crisis in our democratic institutions of governance. And I do believe it is a crisis. So it's not an exaggeration. But this evening, you should be reminded of the importance of not just focusing at the national level or even at the global level, which we do so much of at SIPA, but also to pay attention and to engage in local politics. Local politics is the place where your voice is much more likely to be heard. I know a lot of you work in the global arena and work in the national arena, but we need you to pay attention locally. And on November 8th, we have 3 important proposals to amend the city charter on the ballot. And they were drafted by the city's Racial Justice Commission. And I won't steal anybody's thunder, but I believe this is a first in the United States. And it's extremely important. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And so before I introduce Mayor Nutter, I just want to say to all of you who vote in New York City, racial justice is on New York City's ballot. That doesn't happen very often, and you need to pay attention, you need to vote, and you need to get everybody that you know to vote. Okay, now I get to introduce our moderator, Mayor Michael Nutter, and he'll introduce the rest of the panelists. All of you in this room, I'm sure, know Mayor Michael Nutter. He is the David N. Dinkins Professor of Professional Practice in Urban and Public Affairs here at Columbia at SIPA. And he was the two-term former mayor of Philadelphia. And the part of your bio that always amazes me, Mayor Nutter, is that you spent 15 years in the Philadelphia City Council and somehow managed to stand tall after that experience and then run for mayor and to really improve the lives of all people in Philadelphia. And now we're just so lucky to have him here. I'm just going to say one thing about Mayor Nutter. His bio is long. You can read it in the program. When we were looking for somebody to be the inaugural David N. Dinkins professor, Mayor Dinkins was still with us, and he was involved in the recruitment process and in the interview process. And once Mayor Nutter came, that was the end of the process. Mayor Dinkins said, okay, this is it. We can announce the chair. I'm ready, and we can't do better. And I feel like we at SIPA are so fortunate that Mayor Dinkins took such care in finding Mayor Nutter to be the inaugural chair. Not only, of course, has he continued Mayor Dinkins' work, but he brings all of his experience and his knowledge to this university. And we are really, again, so lucky to have you here, Mayor Nutter. And for those of you who don't know, he still continues to engage in the political sphere. And just last week, he was appointed chair of the Treasury Department's Racial Equity Advisory Commission by Treasury Secretary Janice Yellen. So it's my pleasure to give the mic over to Mayor Nutter and have him moderate this panel. Thank you so much.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Esther, thank you for the quite overly generous introduction. I am honored, and I think about the work and the legacy of Mayor Dinkins every day, being the inaugural chair, trying to walk in his footsteps and maintaining the integrity of. Actually, I took over Mayor Dinkins' course when he stopped teaching. He was obviously still alive, but he stopped teaching, and I have maintained the structure of that course in honor of Mayor Dinkins. So if you took the course a long time ago, if you're a SIPA student, it is in the same format and the same structure as Mayor Dinkins created it, and I would never do anything different. I'm really honored and pleased. This is exciting. I wish I had thought of this when I was in office to have something like this. But New York is known across the country and around the world as a thought leader. So many of us, starting with myself, have imitated, duplicated, or tried to bring to our own cities much of what has come from New York over decades. You pick a mayor of New York City, and for the most part, any number of their initiatives have found their way into cities. And again, I know, speaking for myself, I certainly took many lessons from New York and brought them to Philadelphia, and we're a better city as a result. I get the honor and pleasure of trying to moderate a fantastic panel. I've always felt as a moderator, it's kind of like a referee. You're there, but you should not really be noticed all that much. Just get out of the way. And when you have 4 superstars on a panel, it'll be pretty easy to get out of the way. Jennifer Jones-Austin, CEO and Executive Director of Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, FPWA, and Commissioner, New York City Racial Justice Commission. Jennifer is a 4th-generation leader of faith and social justice and has maintained a fight for equity during her career. As CEO and Executive Director of FPWA, an anti-poverty public policy advocacy organization with 170 member agencies and faith partners, She has led and secured monumental change in social policy to strengthen and empower the disenfranchised and marginalized. We are honored, Jennifer, to have you here with us tonight. Melanie Ash, General Counsel, NYC Racial Justice Coalition. Melanie has served as General Counsel to the New York City Racial Justice Commission since 2021 on loan from the New York City Law Department, where she was recently promoted to Deputy Chief of the Affirmative Litigation Division. As GC, she oversaw the development of proposals to amend the New York City Charter to begin to uproot structural racism in New York City's government. Khary Lazarre-White, Executive Director. How close was it? Lazarre. Okay, I got the first one, mess up the second one. Khary Lazarre-White, Executive Director and co-founder of the Brotherhood of Sister Soul. Khary is a writer, educator, activist, social entrepreneur, and civil rights lawyer whose work centers on the intersection of race, class, education, organizing, and the law. And next to Khary, Ansa, MPA 2023. It's happening. It's gonna happen. Ansa's a native New Yorker and a former student from East Harlem and second-year MPA student at Columbia University SIPA. Previous background includes working with reunification of unaccompanied children in Chicago for 3 years, and moving back to New York to work with the Census Bureau to focus on increasing response rates of the immigrant communities in the city. I'm going to ask Jennifer to discuss the role of the Racial Justice Commission and the development of these proposals. Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you. Always the Honorable Michael Nutter, Professor Nutter. I first want to acknowledge the impact that David Dinkins had on my life and the opportunity that he gave me on numerous occasions to come to SIPA and to present, to lecture, to be a part of conversations and discussions with the students here. And I'll share with you that one of the last times that I saw him was at an event where I came over to say hello, and he said, "Don't say hello to me if you're not going to tell me if you're not here to tell me you're not, if you're not going to tell me you're not running for mayor, if you're not going to tell me you're running for mayor." I can't even think it because I don't even want to get it right because I was like, ah. But he says, "Don't come over here and kiss me if you're not going to tell me you're running for mayor." And I think about it today, and I'm like, yeah, no, but I am running for racial justice. So I think he'd be proud in this moment, right? Sure. I am running for racial justice. Esther Fuchs has been a dear friend and colleague going back to our Bloomberg years. And that's taking us back now, it seems maybe nearly 20 years, or maybe it is 20 years from the very beginning, and has stayed the course, just championing the needs of those who are vulnerable and made vulnerable, and has gifted me many opportunities to join in that work. And so that's what she's doing here this evening by bringing us all together. Good. Cannot thank you enough. And I'd be remiss if I did not recognize the woman who's in the front row to my left, who's got her head down.
Apparently she's
our Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services here in New York City, Ann Williams-Isom, who I also claim as my BFF. So I think she's here for the issues and not for me. I think that's fair to say. So let me begin by, I want to open this up by helping you all to appreciate how we got here, how we got to having 3 measures that are on the ballot to be voted upon and decided by New Yorkers. My background is in policy and systems work. I went to law school, and while there, I like to say I found my calling. Hi, good to see you. So good to see you, Linda. I like to say that I got my call. I recognized my calling was revealed, working to, as I put it, help save, serve, and protect children who are vulnerable in this society. And I quickly came to appreciate, I was doing some work in the courts, that I really wasn't the best at working on family court matters, on cases on a day-to-day basis, that my best work could be done in the systems and in policy work. And so that's where I've been parked for now nearly 30 years. And, you do systems work, you do policy work and programming work, trying to affect change, community by community, individual by individual, family by family. And soon enough, you grow to appreciate that, what's that line? Like, you can feed a man a fish, for a day, but if you want to teach him how to fish, if you want him to learn how to take care of himself, you got to feed him for a lifetime and teach him how to fish. I always say Black people don't speak in adages and proverbs and all that. But anyway, I also learned that if you want to really change the world and change the system, you're not going to get it done by programs. And frankly, even by policy alone. Because if programs and policies are based on flawed foundations and structures, then it's like a Band-Aid approach. You're trying through policy and program to correct something that is inherently like flawed. And it can't be done. You cannot put a Band-Aid on a wound that is deep and like just continues to bleed out and think that you're fixing the problem or you're solving it, in perpetuity, sustainably. Well, when COVID hit us and we saw what was happening in Black and Brown communities, how devastating was COVID upon the communities, Black and Brown persons, people who were living in densely populated communities, having to go out to work. And I'm talking about Black and low-income communities and Brown in the main, having to keep going out day to day, getting on subways that maybe weren't, like the safest when it came to the spread of the disease, working in places and spaces where they had to interface with people who might have been carrying the disease, living in densely populated homes, right? Many people like to a bedroom and into an apartment. We kept on saying, well, what's going on here? Why is this happening? Not having access to quality health care, not being able to stay at home, right? Because of their situations. People were scratching their heads. Well, what's going on here? Many of us who've been doing policy and program work, we knew what was going on. People here at SIPA knew what was going on. The social determinants of health were in play. Income, lack of access to quality health care, inadequate wages, lack of, not having jobs that guaranteed that they could stay home, or that if they were sick, they could stay at home. We knew what was going on. And at the same time, we saw what was happening with, the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. And what we appreciated there too was that, those crimes were race-based, and the social determinants of health had significant racial elements in them. Back in 2020, I wrote an article. It was an opinion piece for the Daily News. And in it, I championed the efforts of people in the streets here in New York City and across the nation and around the world who were out there speaking up against injustice in policing. But I asked the question, will we allow this moment to pass us by without looking at how racism pervades every pillar of society? And then I said it differently. If we were out here talking about inequity in education, in healthcare, children, Black and Brown children are dying every day in the education system here in New York City and around the nation. It's a slow death, but they're dying. Black and Brown children and parents are dying from inequitable healthcare. It's a slow death at times. Would as many people be out on the streets if we were talking about those issues? So I began to dig my heels in and think about what more can be done. And then just a few months later, then Mayor Bill de Blasio came calling. And he said, maybe we can do something about this. These issues are not, of this moment and this time. They are deep-seated. They relate all the way back to slavery, structural racism, propped up like in the laws of slavery. Bring it forward to the United States Constitution, declaring that people of African descent, enslaved persons, were 3/5 human. Now, they say that was for representation in Congress, but what did it do? It set in motion a way of thinking about persons of African descent as being less than. My father wrote a book in 1979 titled God in the Ghetto. And in it, he essentially described the system. And he said, we have he said, the system is a system of capitalism, racism, and militarism, all working to continually oppress people of color. And he said, a surface diagnosis of the system reveals a sick sociology based on a faulty anthropology, which emanates from a false theology. What he was speaking to is that we have used in the society religion as a justification for keeping certain people disadvantaged. We're still doing that, right? And what essentially he was saying is that if we look at God as white and male, then we order our society anthropologically. If the white male looks most like God, who hangs in the churches on the cross in the form of white person, a white male, then the white male must be supreme because the white male looks most like God. And then sociologically, we'll order our society accordingly. And we'll place Black people on the bottom, right? And in today's world, Black women, the extreme polar opposite of white men, and we'll order the society accordingly. And the rules will follow therefrom, which is why today, Black women and brown women earn 64 cents and 56 cents on the dollar, respectively, to what a white man earns. How is that justified? Because we've got a system that says it's okay. And because some of our founders decided that it would be okay, and they would use religion as a justification for it. We're still living in that world today. And until we begin to look at the structures that have allowed this to, just be perpetuated on us for now better than 400 years, we're not going to get anywhere. Policies and programs are critically important. But if they are based on inherently racist structures and systems, we're not going to get anywhere. So when Bill de Blasio called, I said, I get it. Right now, he wasn't everybody's favorite then, and he's not everybody's favorite now. I get that. But I seized the moment because I said, hey, maybe we've got something here. And when I appreciated that this has never been done before in the nation, and we had a mayor who was on his way out, well, why not? What did he have to lose? And we had everything to gain. So we pulled together a commission of 11 members, people who hail from all 5 boroughs of the city of New York, people who in their own respective rights have been engaged in the work of justice, community organizers, people who are on the ground in the community fighting against violence, visited upon Black and brown communities and among Black and brown communities. We brought together people who've been engaged in the work of justice in the courts and in the law. We brought together faith leaders, right? All sitting down and figuring out what can we do to begin to dismantle structural racism. And we assembled a team of Racial Justice Commission staff who were as dedicated to the issue of how do we go about figuring this out? What can we possibly do? The commission was given the charge of looking at the New York City Charter, which is our Constitution, to identify ways that we could begin to dismantle structural racism in government functioning. Again, we have to hold on to this appreciation that racism is not a one-to-one relationship. That our government, right? And we've been led to believe the way that this system has been structured, we were led to believe that racism was like, oh, your teacher didn't like you and was giving you a bad grade because you were a person of color, or your neighbor didn't like you. The fact of the matter is we've all been birthed into a racist society, and the structures have upheld it. And one of the things that we appreciate is that the laws uphold it. So the charge that we were given as a Charter Revision Commission was to look at the New York City Charter, look how the charter is set up, and to begin to determine how we could dismantle structural racism here in New York City. We engaged with the community at large. It was COVID, but we still felt the need to go out and be about talking with individuals and with community leaders, persons who with everyday experiences, lived experiences, about what they were experiencing. And what was fascinating was that more than 3,000 people in the midst of COVID showed themselves, engaged with us to tell us about what they experienced. We heard a lot, of course, about challenges that people continually have with the justice system, law enforcement, and in the courts. We heard a lot about that. We heard from mothers and fathers who shared with us that they just felt that their children were not receiving a quality education because of the color of their skin and the zip codes in which they live, compared to children in more affluent communities. We heard from women, especially Black women, working in city government, about how they had great performance reviews, but they couldn't get a promotion, how they weren't earning the same as other people in the same roles that they had. We heard people talk to us about land use issues and the disparities that attend there. We heard people talking about lack of access to capital. And a lot of it was race-based. We saw the data. We talked to subject matter experts, thought leaders from around the country to hear, what they'd learned in their respective fields and their respective work activities. And a lot of it backed up and supported what we were hearing from everyday New Yorkers. What we grew to appreciate was that there were so many issues that had to be dealt with. There was no way in the world that we could put on the ballot 300, 400 proposals that would attack and address each and every issue that people were bringing to us. So what we sought to do was to try to bucket these issues, to look at what people were talking to us about. And I'll quickly share with you what the buckets, there were 6 buckets. When we heard what people were saying, we tried to think systemically about the patterns. The buckets were inequity and quality services that promote social and emotional well-being, inequity in work, advancement, and wealth building, inequity within and across neighborhoods that inhibits thriving individuals, families, and communities, marginalization and overcriminalization of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other persons of colors, persons, and communities, inequity in representation and decision-making, and the lack of enforcement and accountability of government and related entities. Once we had those buckets, we thought about, well, how do we go into the charter and do something, that is going to essentially affect change concerning each of these areas? And what we realized was that what we could do was put forth some foundational changes that would not just in the moment, but for a lifetime, if you will, in perpetuity, cause government to engage with, think about, look upon all people as having, as being legitimately, legitimate New Yorkers and having a legitimate right to the best that New York can provide. That we had to restart rethinking about how to structure government in such a way to hold government accountable to such an aspiration and a vision. And then how could we, in real time, begin to concretely make those changes? And so I'm going to stop here. And
okay. Moderator error. I should have given some context to our conversation tonight, which is at least to mention what the 3 ballot proposals are. As I understand it, because of the great research by Esther, there are actually 4 proposals on the ballot, 3 developed by the commission. But the first proposal is actually the Environmental Bond Act of 2022. This proposal would allow New York State to borrow $4.2 billion through a bond issuance for specific environment-related projects and policy efforts. Proposal number 2, and 2, 3, and 4 are the proposals under discussion tonight developed by the commission. Proposal 2, Statement of Values for City Government. This measure would create a mission statement of sorts for New York's government by adding a preamble to the city charter that includes a statement of, quote, values and vision. The ballot proposal says that aims to create a, quote, just and equitable city for all. As I understand it, apparently the New York City Charter presently does not have a preamble at all. Proposal number 3, racial equity plans and office. This measure would bring 3 new requirements to the city charter, mandating that all city agencies create racial equity plans every 2 years, establishing a new Office of Racial Equity to coordinate racial equity planning across city government, and creating a commission on racial equity. That commission would identify and propose priorities for racial equity planning and review the racial equity plans for each city agency. And proposal number 4, true cost of living. This measure would mandate that the city government use a new method to calculate a, quote, true cost of living in the city without taking into account public, private, or informal assistance a person or household may receive. Proposals 2, 3, and 4 are the topics of our discussion this evening. I'm going to ask Melanie Ash to explain the role of her organization in advocating for those proposals for about 10 minutes or so.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to join you tonight. I think Jennifer and I talked about, and just to back up and give some background, I'm the general counsel for the commission. So along with the rest of the staff, I worked with Jennifer and the other commissioners to put in place what they envisioned, to help them prepare the actual language, to draft the proposals, to try to achieve the vision that Jennifer spoke about. So I think we just decided it would be helpful if I could talk about a little bit more about each of the proposals, give you a little bit more flavor for what the commission intended, why the proposals were written the way they were, and maybe point out a few little things that policy wonks might really appreciate that you might not see in the really quick views you're going to see about the proposals throughout the rest of the campaign.
Well, it's a policy school. It is full of wonks.
So yeah,
they're excited.
Yes, exactly. And I think, I think we, the commission staff and the commissioners themselves really geek out about some of the little things that we tried to include in these proposals. So we thought we would point them out to you. So on the first proposal, which is the statement of values, we sometimes talk about it as aspiration. It was to New Yorkers really see themselves, and people see New York as a city that has a lot of values. It feels strongly about racial equity. It feels strongly about fairness and justice for all. There's been a sort of a history of movements of fairness and justice within New York City. And I think the commissioners felt strongly that those values should be the guiding values for city government. So city government should be required to think about and act on and try to put in place policies and programs and things that would address and try to achieve those values, to live those values. And so the preamble was created basically looking at other preambles around the world, from the South African Constitution to individual cities having new constitutions, to try to come up with what are the things that matter to New Yorkers. We had sessions where New Yorkers themselves could tell us about that. And so we tried to draft a preamble that would get at those values, that would state those values and put those out in front, and then we could try to live up to those. Some of the things you'll see if you read the preamble, and I would really encourage you to do that on our website or elsewhere. It is a land acknowledgement. This is Lenape land. This is traditional Lenape territory. That's something that hasn't, you're starting to see it a little bit more around New York City, but it's never been written into the charter. An acknowledgement of some of the values and the history of injustice that we've seen in the city, but also a really positive, hopeful statement for the future. How do we want our city to be? And one of the sort of technical details about the preamble is that the way the charter question is written and the language is written is that if it's adopted by New Yorkers, city government will be required to be guided by it. They'll be required to try to achieve and to be guided by these principles and these values in their planning functions and in their auditing. The auditors will be required to say, how are we doing compared to these values? Are we working towards these values? So that's sort of the vision statement and that the preamble is supposed to be bringing. The second proposal is to create racial equity plans, a racial equity office, and a racial equity commission. So we see this as sort of the infrastructure for racial equity. To put racial equity at the heart of city government, there would be a new Office of Racial Equity created. Every 2 years, every single city agency would be required to engage in a racial equity planning process. Using data to try to identify disparities that exist within their realm and their sphere, and to try to make a plan for how they're going to reduce those disparities going forward. And the interesting thing from a policy perspective is that it was written and designed so that that planning process would be hand in hand with the budget process. So when each agency is considering how they would achieve racial equity and reduce disparities, they will also be figuring out their budget to ensure they have enough money, resources to try to do the work that they're planning for. And then all of those plans will roll up into a citywide plan. And the third prong, which is the Racial Equity Commission, is essentially for New Yorkers to have a voice in the racial equity planning process. They will identify priorities, which then the government will have to include in their planning process. They will have an opportunity to look to to criticize, to comment on, and to change those priorities over time. So every 2 years will be a new plan, the community might say, well, that's not our priority anymore. This is how we want it to go. That commission is independent of city government in the sense that no one elected official has a control of a majority of the members in terms of appointments. And the goal of it is to bring voices into government that are not usually represented in government, from people who are recipients of public benefits, people who live in public housing, people who are justice involved in their past, voices that don't always get a say in the way that city government functions. And one way that the commission sought to achieve that was by, for example, requiring that commission could be compensated for some of the costs that would allow them to free them up to participate as commissioners. Right now, I think those who have the luxury to be on commissions are usually those who have an income that's large. They can afford to take time away from work to be on a commission. And that the commissioners felt that was important to expand the breadth of the people who could participate in government and public life by reimbursing their childcare expenses, their home health care expenses, so that they could leave their family member, whoever they were caring for at home, and come into do the work of a commission like anyone else. So they weren't kept out of the process by their own circumstances. And the third proposal is measuring the true cost of living, is essentially seeking to change the conversation, to move it away from living in poverty. What does it mean to live in poverty, which is guided by the federal poverty line, which is a number we know the criteria have not been updated since the 1960s. It's a national number that doesn't take into account regional differences. So if you live in North Dakota and you live in New York, the poverty line is the same, which I think New Yorkers will recognize doesn't take into account at all what it costs to live in New York City. So the conversation that the commissioners wanted to do here is to shift the conversation from living in poverty to living with dignity. What does it require to live with dignity in New York City? Your essential needs all met, and to have that number, which is a number we don't know right now, have that reported every year by the government, providing information which could affect and guide policy, which policymakers, advocates, union leaders could all use as a number to advocate for salaries, for change, and economic justice generally. So it's an attempt to shift the conversation to try to get at the economic injustices in the city. And so that's what the commission was intending with the proposals. There's so much more detail in there, but which I'm happy to talk to if you have questions.
We'll jump into that.
Oh, I would say we have heard sort of misinformation that's out there about whether or not people could bring a lawsuit based on, is this going to cost the city money defending lawsuits on all of these different proposals? No, each of these three proposals are specifically not creating a right of action, so someone couldn't sue based on them, but the government would still be held accountable to try to move forward in using these, basically try to achieve the vision in the preamble, and trying to by the terms of the statute itself. But it wouldn't be something where, as an individual citizen, could sue and say, I have not received my true cost of living.
Right.
Happy to talk more later as we end dialogue with everyone.
We will jump into it. Khary, can you talk about the importance of these proposals from the perspective of your organization?
Sure. So first, good evening. I really want to thank Jennifer and Melanie for all of their work on this commission. Other colleagues and friends, Derek Hamilton, an economist who was the economic advisor to Bernie Sanders and was a part of this commission. And I think I hear his voice in some of the writing pretty clearly. I think this is a rare document from government. There are parts of this document that are even soaring in language. I know that might sound striking. Usually you don't hear language like what is contained in this overview that supports the proposals. I would encourage everybody in the room to read the full report. You'll see it at about 150 pages. It's not really that long. There's a lot of appendix and support, but the actual language I think is striking. I just want to read from it briefly. In the preamble, there are several kind of bulleted items that we haven't gone into detail, but just when you imagine a city like this, a safe, healthy, and sustainable living environment, a resilient neighborhood served by quality and accessible infrastructure, and a robust local economy, vibrant and welcoming public spaces throughout New York City where everyone belongs and everyone can move freely. Resources necessary to prosper economically and build wealth. Safe, secure, and affordable housing. Quality and culturally relevant child and youth supports, including early childhood and pre-kindergarten through the 12th grade education. Compassionate and culturally responsive health, trauma, and mental health care. Access and opportunity to participate meaningfully in government decision-making, and humane, empathetic, and respectful treatment. That's a city I would like to live in.
Not too much to ask.
It's a city that doesn't exist yet. It's a challenge, I think. And that's why I really encourage folks to read through it. I mean, it's not language you often see in terms of the framing of what a city should look like. Right. One of the reasons I commend those on the commission, and I think the language is so important, is I think we're in a very difficult political time where there is often a lacking of vision of a different way forward for municipalities, for states, and certainly for the country. When you think about the kind of politics that we see internationally and locally, and the framing of big ideas is so often now through a fascistic perspective or a reactionary religious perspective. We see very little government articulating broad visions that are from a progressive perspective. I don't mean individual policies, but I mean when you look at countries and cities and states being led with new and innovative visions, if you think about the new and innovative visions that we're seeing, they are reactionary and right-wing. And so to articulate a vision like that for the city, which very few people, if anyone running for mayor articulates, or anyone running for governor, or certainly anyone running for president, articulates a vision like that of a humane government structure, it's a challenge. It's a challenge, I think, because of why it's so needed. There are aspects, again, to this proposal that highlight, the history of different forms of oppression in this city. So if we're talking about systemic responses, we have to talk about the systemic conditions that people are facing. It's both the history. We talk about this being Lenape land. We talk about the African burial ground within this report. Former professor of law here, Kellis Parker, was the first tenured Black professor in the history of the Ivy Leagues. I worked with him on the designation of the African burial ground many years ago. This was a space where Africans were buried down near Wall Street, and then of course was paved over, and a federal building was built on top of it. You have Seneca Village, which was raised so that Central Park could be built. You have Rikers Island, which is named for somebody whose employment was to capture enslaved Black people and return them to slavery. That's who the Rikers family was. You have Robert Moses, still revered, but he would deem Black and brown communities as slums to build the Cross Bronx Expressway, to build Lincoln Center, to destroy community. Stuyvesant Town, built as a whites-only enclave. These are all examples that are in the report. They're the national examples. When we talk about systemic racism, what does that mean? It's a term that a lot of times people talk about today, but what does it mean systemically? It's the GI Bill that allowed white, working class, and middle class people to build wealth. Many people who say, how did I benefit? Your grandfather, most likely, due to oppression of women, was able to access a loan and purchase a home 3 generations ago. Those loans were not accessible to Black and brown people, period. Social Security, often not able to be paid into by Black and brown people. When you look at structures like that, whether it's redlining, which continues today with its horrific history, or you look at labor law. So today, a good friend of mine is a woman named Ai-jen Poo, dear friend, leader of Domestic Workers United, one of the big advocates for the care economy, and talking about how we should have protection for domestic workers. There's an old adage that, Black folk and racism against Black people is the canary in the coal mine. That all people who come here, often, whether they are aware or not, are experiencing racism that was perpetrated against Black people and now moved on to another population. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you go back and look at labor law in this country and protections around what it means to work, 2 groups of workers were excluded from those labor protections. Those were farm workers and domestic workers. And they were excluded because then reactionary Democratic senators from the South said, you will not provide labor protections to those who work in our home and pick the cotton and tobacco in our fields. Who were those people? Black people. It was accepted and they were removed from labor protections. Now who is picking the fields? overwhelmingly low-income South American, Central American people. Who is doing the domestic work? Women of all backgrounds, Asian, Latina, white immigrants. But all those folks don't have labor protections because Black people were denied those labor protections 70 years ago. Those results exist today. That's what systemic racism looks like. So if we're talking about a systemic response to it, we have to talk about what it is that we are coming from. Today in New York, for the population that I work with, I run a social justice organization in Harlem. It's 25 blocks away from here, and it's a different world than Columbia. So the greatest disparity of wealth of any county in America is the county of New York, Manhattan. In Manhattan, the top 10% survives on $860,000 a year or more, $860,000. The bottom 15% survives on under $10,000. So you imagine, again, operating as a family with less than $10,000. That is the dominant percentage of young people that I work with in Harlem on the blocks that I work on.
Khary, can you give those numbers again?
Sure. You have the top 15% in the country surviving, in the county surviving on $860,000 or more, the island of Manhattan. And the lowest 10% is under $10,000. That is, of course, an aggregate. We talked about the federal poverty rate, which is $26,000. So if you earn $28,000 or $30,000 for a family of 4, you're not deemed, quote, poor. It's a ridiculous standard. You are making decisions between travel and healthcare, clothes, and food. Another issue that's very central in terms of inequity, in terms of the population I work with, 10% of the New York City public school system is homeless. The face of homelessness so often in our city are often mentally ill men on a train, or individual people you may come across who need an array of services to become stable and are a reflection of, again, the inequity in our system and in our society. But the largest group of homeless people in this city are single mothers and their children. So if 100,000 children are attending school every day, not knowing where they will sleep that night, moving room to room or house to house, how are they supposed to do well, even if they figure out a way into a good school? If they're moved to a shelter, they're moved to a different housing situation, how are they supposed to get to school? That's structural inequity. That's structural inequality that folk face every single day. So yes, we can look at it from a historic lens. Yes, we can look at it from what was in the Constitution and what happened for generations upon generations in this country. But we can look right now today about what structural inequality looks like. So I serve on the board of Community Service Society, which is the largest anti-poverty policy organization in the city. And the framing of their work is that they respond for and on behalf of the third of New Yorkers who live in poverty or near the poverty line. We are at nearly 9 million as a population. That means 3 million people in the city live in poverty or near the poverty line. 3 million people. And so at the beginning of my comments, when I'm talking about what big solutions look like, I have yet to see a mayor, those I loved, like David Dinkins, who's like an uncle and dear friend of my father's, and those I despised, like Giuliani, and everything in between. I've yet to see an agenda for responding to that level of inequity that deals with homelessness and mental health issues and schooling and employment and healthcare that is comprehensive. Right. It is the only way to respond to these issues. And mayors and deputy mayors and folks who have worked in government know that. We need big solutions. And so when I see this report, the reason it resonates with me for our young people is that it does articulate a big vision. I do think that the challenge in the last area of my comments is focused on this. How is it implemented? Right. And because budgets are political statements. Yeah. New York City has a budget of $101 billion. If we are going to tackle issues of inequity and inequality in this city, we have to have an agency strong enough to implement what this vision is. And there's a long history, whether it's Commissioner of Human Rights, I was one of the commissioners of human rights, stepped down under de Blasio, whether you're talking about the Civilian Complaint Review Board, you're talking about the Inspector General that supposedly oversees the NYPD, they have insufficient resources to do their job.
Right.
So if whatever political entity comes out of this is not sufficiently funded and staffed, then it will have no teeth to do the work that it needs to do. And so that will be the challenge, I think, of implementation.
Absolutely, it always is. Ansa, can you speak to the importance of these proposals and even more specifically, the role of the university in engaging policies on advancing racial equity?
Yes,
and then we're going to open things up.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Esther Fuchs and Mayor Michael Nutter for having me tonight. Yes, as someone from the Harlem community, someone who was born and raised, and as someone who chose to go to Columbia University for graduate school to help improve the inequities in many communities, a community that I come from, these ballot proposals are very topical. They are much needed. And when we speak about equity, it's also important to acknowledge that communities have different needs and we have to meet them where we at when there's so much change going on politically. So when I came to Columbia University at SIPA, coming from a background where I work closely with immigrant communities, families whose children were seeking shelter in the United States because it was too difficult to live in their home countries. And then the problems they were facing, such as finding shelter, affordable shelter, food, and just adjusting overall. Those patterns were very similar from my community and the community that where Columbia is. Therefore, I was very involved. I was very ready to take on the challenge of coming to SIPA and join the CiVEC, which is the Civic and Voter Engagement Coalition. Here is a student-run club where we focus on civic engagement for the community and for the student community overall. From my working with unaccompanied minors to working closely with the immigrant community at the Census Bureau, the common theme I've noticed is civic engagement is crucial for representation. And then what these ballot proposals place an importance on is accurate representation, so we can actually combat the racial inequity faced in New York City. So with the Civic student-led organization, we focus a lot on hosting events for the community. Last year, there was a voter registration drive that we hosted to spread information to the larger Harlem community to register to vote, to understand who is on the ballot. We just did an event yesterday, actually, where we hosted a nonprofit organization that came in to speak to talk about digital access and how that's playing a big part as we see so much change in technology and the voting space, and how technology is ramping up to provide information about voting. And we're doing more events where we have political candidates come in to speak about their races that they have run. So as a student body, it's very important, in a public policy school, it's very important to be abreast on the changing ballots, especially in New York City, and as many of us who will eventually go on to work in city government, myself included. So yeah, that's where we bring this information to at the Civic and Voter Engagement Coalition. Any students here that would be interested in being involved, also feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
All righty. Just one moderator moment. I really, really wish I thought of this like 15 years ago, but certainly tremendously timely. And I think, Khary, to your comment, at the end of the day, it's all about implementation. You know, I love a great idea as much as the next person. I love a fantastic plan. Implementation is where the real work takes place, and it takes time, right? And so there might be a few mayors, but if people are focused and stay on the mission and understand, you know, the point and the purpose. There's this slightly bizarre behavior by some that apparently some mayors think that when they come into office, the only good ideas will be the ones that they propose, and that everything the predecessor did apparently has to be thrown away. I don't know what that condition is. I don't know why it exists. They
call it ego.
They become allergic to anything that happened before, and I see it all across the country. We're going to open the floor. We are again focused on these three ballot proposals. You have expert speakers here, and so if you could just, I guess, the easiest thing, raise your hand, your name, if you represent an organization or if you're part of some group or something, please mention that. And let's get some.
Nutter, as we begin,
yes.
If I may just say a word or two about implementation. The issue, the concerns around implementation were ever present on the minds of the commission members as well as the commission staff. One of the things that we appreciated was that we could not let it get in the way of the vision. And that if we did not at least begin by seeking to change the charter and in so doing change the law, we'd get nowhere, right? You know, I'll share with you that one of my former bosses in City Hall, when I shared with this individual the proposals, the immediate response I got was, well, you know, you could fail.
Okay.
And my response was, well, if I do and the commission does what we believe is right and just, we will not fail. If New Yorkers determine that they, you know, don't want to be educated and informed and get out and vote, then New Yorkers may fail. And I'm not really talking about whether or not they vote up or vote down, right. But if they do not engage, right. But it won't be that the commission, the commissioners and the commission staff fail. But what I heard in that was, oh my God, what if you succeed?
Right.
This changes the game if you succeed.
Right.
And so we first and foremost felt like we needed to put these proposals out there for them to be acted upon by the New York City electorate. And then we took a lot of time with that second proposal, trying to ensure that accountability was seated in government. You know, an annual, a biannual report that the mayor has to release to the public, putting, you know, the onus not just on government, but on all New Yorkers for holding a mayor accountable, right? Putting in place a commission comprised of everyday New Yorkers who would be our voice. So these were the first steps that we took, and we know that there are many laws in that charter. There are many reports that are supposed to be produced, and they aren't. But in this, in making this move, we all have to appreciate that there's mutual and shared accountability. Right. We talked about the budget scoring to align with the plan and the way that the proposal is laid out, you know, that this will be done in concert with or timed with the releasing of the annual budgets for the city of New York. So there can be a pushback. You know, how does the budget support these equity plans? So that was the thinking. We don't have budget scoring, if you will, but there's a beyond the proposals to begin to think about issues like that. We just didn't have the time for that. But implementation was and is ever present on the minds of the commission, the commissioners and the commission staff. And if I can just quickly take one more liberty. You've met Melanie Ash. We've got our executive director, Harold Miller, who's here with us, executive director of the commission, as well as Jimmy Pan, who's the director of policy for the commission.
Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Here to represent. Melanie, I was struck by something you said earlier. So get your questions ready. I'm giving you a little time. When you mentioned that doesn't necessarily give a citizen a right of action, but what I'm hearing is it may cause citizens to take action to make things right, which ultimately happens at the ballot box, right? Because this is an accountability measure. It is something, it's as compared to what? This is what it said. This is what you did. Is there alignment or is there space between those two things? And if you can hold someone to what it says and make people accountable, it will, over time, it will adjust their behavior.
And I think the proposal, there's language in the proposal that, for example, the auditing function, which is largely one of the main auditing bodies, is the controller, who audits the performance of the various agencies and in achieving their goal. The controller is required under this proposal to be guided by and to be auditing how the city is doing as compared to the values stated in the preamble. So there are ways in which there's accountability written in, not through lawsuits, but through actual obligations in fulfilling your function. You need to be guided by, and you're required to be looking to these values that are stated in the preamble. So there are ways in which, you know, there's accountability, and as you said, in the commission will call out whether the city has been moving it towards its equity plans or not. So there are ways in which there will be a light shone on the performance of the city with respect to its equity plans, if these proposals are put into place.
As my grandmother used to say, you might have some splaining to do. Other questions? Yes. There was a little bit of outside voice.
If I can quickly just share, you know, what I find fascinating about this is people have a hard time publicly saying they don't believe in equity and justice. So they try to find the workarounds or the things that the you know, what will trigger people. So we've heard about, you know, oh, this would create a private right of action and New York would go bankrupt having to defend all these lawsuits. False, absolutely false, as Melanie has shared with you. The other criticism that I've heard is, well, you know, New York is facing, like the rest of the nation, a potential recession. We're just recovering from COVID. We don't have money for this, right? It has been estimated that to build this out and to maintain it, just in terms of like the staff and the supports, maybe $10 million. We have a $101 billion budget. Is $10 million going to cause the city to go bankrupt? But let me put it to you a different way. How much money is this city expending in corrective actions to address the inequities that persist? Whether it be having to, you know, like children having to repeat grades because they have, you know, subpar quality educational experiences, or children graduating from high school. And then, you know, if they go to a college, having to take remediation courses to get ahead. So many people in Rikers, the resources that we're expending there, if we looked at, you know, the inequities that abound with respect to community by community, individuals and families, and what has gone unchecked for so long. And I'll add that the McKinsey Group issued a report in 2019 based on, you know, hardcore data and assessments. They issued a report that states that if this nation were to center on equity, income and wealth building, and equity that is race-based, that this nation would realize an additional $13 trillion in gross domestic product growth, 4 to 6% gross domestic product growth by 2028. So this whole notion that it's going to cost too much, that's just a red herring. But those are the two issues that I have, as I've moved about, heard are the criticisms.
Other questions? Oh, gentleman in the black shirt, gentleman in the, I mean, you really have to wear the Yankees hat.
Well played wearing the Yankees.
My name is Wilson. Thank you for your lecture. You've been talking about the structural environmental issues. I'm a foreigner, and I was really surprised to read that 65 to 70% of Black kids grow up in a single family household. And that is one way of perpetuating poverty. we haven't talked about that, and I think that is really related to what's happening within that kind of community.
I'll jump in here real quickly and tell you.
I'm not trying to be reactionary.
No, but I'll tell you, the true cost of living is one of the measures that specifically gets at that. What we know is that the true cost of the annual federal poverty level that says that a family of 3 living anywhere in America, 1 adult and 2 children, needs just a little more than $22,000 to not be poor. We know that here in New York City, in what has been deemed the most affordable section of New York City, the most affordable borough, the Bronx, a family of 3 needs, as at the lower end, about $81,000 in order to make ends meet. Wow. Right now, why is this a racial issue? Poverty, in and of itself, does not pick and choose based on color. But when Black women are, as a segment of society, the most educated, but yet their wages are suppressed, and they live and they are steered towards jobs and opportunities where there's occupation and wage segregation, we have to know that if they are the primary breadwinners, then their children will grow up in poverty, which is why, as of 2020, 1 in 4 Black children lives in poverty compared to less than 1 in 10 white children. So these measures are designed to look at those issues, to look at what is happening with respect to wage and occupation segregation, the experiences of people of color when there is 1 breadwinner in the household or the primary breadwinner, and that primary breadwinner is earning 64 cents on the dollar, 56 on the dollar, compared to what a white man earns. That is what is behind several of these proposals. So while in this moment, we did not speak directly to that. Our work and our understanding of the issues and how to come at it was informed by that very issue.
Gentleman in the ball cap, and then I'm going to switch over to the side here.
Ken Miles, I'm a community scholar at Columbia, also a longstanding member of the community board for this district. I guess my question is, so I just got my voter guide today, and that's where I saw the ballot proposal measures. In thinking about, and then I also happened to get a call from WEAC, right, who was talking about ballot measure number 1 today. So kind of, as you think about the first step, the first hurdle being getting out information about these ballot measures, kind of, what's the proverbial Cardi B marketing budget for these ballot measures, right? And also, apart from the amendment for the city charter, is there another avenue for these measures to advance? Because, that's kind of step 1. And to say it plainly, we don't want this initiative to fizzle out like Mets in the postseason.
Wow.
Ouch. Oh.
Yeah. That was harsh.
Very quickly, the city of New York has allocated $5.5 million for education and outreach. The big push has been intentionally held back because we did not want to confuse people with respect to the 2 primaries, have them going to the polls and wondering where the ballot measures are. But you'll soon begin to see blanketing New York, subways and the like. I'm looking over at my general counsel saying, yeah, we got MTA on board, right? You'll start to see messaging about, concerning the ballot measures in a very robust effort. There are other ways to come at this. Rest assured that, we expected I'm speaking as an individual right now. I'm not speaking as the chair of the commission. But, I'm going to vote for these proposals. I'm not telling people how to vote. I'm hoping that my vote, I'm talking personally right now. Mm-hmm. I'm not walking away after these ballot measures pass. And should for some reason they not, I'm still on it. We need a true cost of living measurement here in New York City. Some of these issues can possibly be legislated, and we need to look at that.
All right. Yeah, I want to respond to the second part of what you raised, Ken, and I think a big piece of this is what happens post, hopefully, these passing. So I don't have an answer for the first. I don't know what the Cardi B moment is. But what a powerful moment it would be if the city passes this kind of language that I highlighted in my comments, this articulation of a city that currently doesn't exist, this phrase, dignity rather than poverty. Then, in my view, I said this as an organizer and activist, the ball is in our court. It's about a citywide movement across race and economic strata to say this is the city we demand and want. Once this is in, that's our job to do. I don't have the faith that government will see it through. I don't have the faith that government will achieve the equity we're talking about. But it will give those of us in the organizing and activist community a very sharp tool to use to say, look at this language that you've promised. So many issues that we work on that we haven't talked about some of the agencies that are diametrically opposed to this vision for the city. So it's not just individual actors when you talk about the NYPD or when you talk about corrections. You know, you talk about having a facility like Rikers where, you know, former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara said torture is going on every single night as children are force fought, right? We have people dying monthly there. The space continues to exist. Multiple mayors have not done anything about that. How do you deal with equity in an institution like that? How do you deal with equity in an institution like NYPD, where you're talking about massive numbers of people who are doing everything that is inequitable? How do you reform an institution like that that's not focused on equity? It's got to be something deeper than oversight. So for those of us who are organizing on criminal justice issues, on housing issues, on environmental issues, what it gives us is another tool to push back so that it's no longer only our vision, it has to be our vision, but it's also about using essentially their own language against them. Right? One of the examples around this that I often use is the issue of homelessness in the country. So there was an economic study done on homelessness in the country that if you looked at, and again, there's an issue with how you draw poverty lines across the country, but if you looked at what a cost of living is across municipalities throughout the nation, what would it cost to give every single family that is homeless or individual that's homeless a voucher that allows that person to pay rent monthly for the year? The same cost that it would cost to put everyone into a home is the cost of one battlecraft carrier. So successive presidents, let me repeat that, have decided instead of putting every single person into a home for a year, we're going to build another battlecraft carrier. Right? That's a decision that's being made. So that's what I mean by narrative. How are we articulating it? How are we pushing back in these ways that allow us to both articulate a different vision for the city, for the third of New Yorkers who are living in deep poverty, and then there's a whole nother percentage who are just struggling to stay above poverty, right? And then number two, how do we change narrative to what a just city looks like? So I think the power of this, for those of us who are working from an organizing perspective, is to take this language essentially and use this against the city in particular ways. And I think that's something that we just have to be open about. So I think we have a responsibility to highlight this into our communities, why this is important. Why voting for it is important, yes, but also once we vote for it, to utilize this language in our organizing efforts would be essential.
Yeah. Young lady in the back.
Some years ago, I had the honor of being a business PA, and I believe I was his only foreign-born PA. And so I feel obliged to ask a question about the issue of the intersection of immigrant rights, justice, and racial justice. We have Mayor Adams declaring emergency over the influx of migrants. Does the language of sanctuary cities come into play in this report on racial equity, and what would that mean in terms of resources, in terms of representation, in terms of access?
So let me first, I'm going to begin, and then if you want to pick up, Melanie. The way that we wrote these proposals was we began understanding, we were centering on racism at its core, the foundational, some would say the original sin of America. So we used that as the base, but what we appreciated was that there were so many other related issues: immigration, issues of gender, disparities, and issues of sexual identity, sexual origin. Sexual identity, sexual orientation. For you, I'm a little tired. I'm out here a lot with this, and appreciating that we were looking at equity for everybody. One of the things that these proposals do is we don't center on New York City citizens, we center on residents of New York City. And so we were picking up there and realizing that immigration is an issue in and of itself, and we're envisioning a city for all New York residents, all New York City residents, where they are treated fairly and justly.
Yeah, I would just say that among the many things that this proposal would put in the under the auspices of the Racial Equity Office would be issues of language justice, issues of intersectional oppressions. One of the, for the policy wonks among us, the definition of equity that's here is probably one of the most progressive definitions of equity you'll see, but it talks about intersectionality. And it talks about the ways in which different forms of oppression intersect with each other to create even more oppression. So I think there's definitely a recognition in the commission's work and in the proposal that that racial equity, to address racial equity would address all equity, would address equity for everyone, because these are intersecting oppressions that you can't get rid of one without getting rid of the other. I mean, they go together. And I think the goal of the commission was to obviously focus on racial equity, but by doing so to lift everyone into a fully equitable for all New Yorkers. And I think that, so there are ways in which language justice and justice, that looks at women, that looks at gender equity, that looks at, unequal pay across race and gender and the way they intersect, disability, and trying to make the city more accessible to those who have disabilities. I think that was all built into sort of the proposal for what the Racial Equity Office would do. It would look at racial equity, but it would look at much more than that. And so that was the way in which it was attempting to get at some of those issues that would be faced by immigrant New Yorkers as well.
And just adding that the preamble is aspirational for all New Yorkers. It's not, seating it just, on race matters.
Mm-hmm.
Right up front. And then I've got two, and then I've got one.
My name is Ansa. I'm a first year here at SIPA. I'm concentrating in human rights. So this isn't my concentration, but I've really enjoyed the conversation tonight. I'm also a New Yorker. But my question is more based on the language specifically. So are there implications when writing policies that the language is too broad in defining racial equity? In other words, how can we give representation to multiple issues of structural inequity? We have to limit how much you write and the content within it. And I mean, you sort of already answered it, but I wanted to highlight that more specifically.
Let me take it. So I'm glad that you asked the question, because you just reminded me that another criticism that was lodged by one of the dailies, surprise, surprise, was that, there's no teeth here because it's like they're overly broad and they don't really hone in on specific issues. Our response to that was that when you appreciate how pervasive, how extensive, racism is, how it penetrates every element of our society and how we engage. If you start with 2 or 3, you might miss it. That's why we created proposals that first were aspirational and set a vision that is more specific and concrete as to what a just and fair city looks like for everyone. So we lay that out to cast the vision, to then live into the vision. And then by creating a racial equity office, that it requires that every city agency and mayoral office produce equity plans based on data and indicators that demonstrate where they're falling short and where they need to come on up. We're seeking to get at very specific concrete issues. So that was the approach that we took. And the aim here, again, is to begin the work, to reset. I said at the outset that if you're trying to address issues, working on a flawed foundation with a flawed foundation, you're not going to get to where you need to be. We're trying to reset the foundation.
One of the things that happens in this kind of work, I hear the overly broad criticism. I can assure you, if it were a particularly narrow and focused proposal, the criticism would be It's much too narrow. You haven't covered many things, and this is not going to do anything. I've got, from what I recall, in the black with the wonderful glasses, in the white sweater, and then the lady with the white glasses. Yes, this is glasses night. And then our professor. Yes, ma'am.
What a pleasure to be here. My name is Sylvia Schuler. I was professor of economics here for a bunch of years. So very nervous here. And I also headed up the gender and policy program. It's fabulous to do that. I love the language. The left needs to be inspiring in this era of extremes. I'm also enormously enthusiastic about rolling out these equity plans, across city organizations. But my question is there going to be a concerted attempt to involve the best private sector?
Excuse me?
I'll give you some examples. I've done a lot of work recently on how to create advocacy for people of color and other diverse high achievers, whatever they are, in the talent pipeline. Because it's not about equity of work, it's mostly about equity of progression to good jobs and well-paying. And what I found recently is that only 5% of Black managers in both for-profit and in public organizations ever get sponsorship. Right? And that is a must if you're going to get from the middle to the top. Whereas 23% of white males get sponsorship and women are somewhere in between. So what's doable? Well, the private sector who more readily sees the connect between the cost of doing nothing and therefore the urgency of actually putting something quickly in the field, right? It's one of the things they sometimes do is doing great stuff on this one. Both the Bloomberg Corporation and American Express has created a scenario where their leaders are constrained to have a diverse portfolio of sponsees that they actually pull up to decision making. And the other thing that's happening in Plum Alley, as well as at IBM, is that there is a lot of money going into recruiting disadvantaged teenagers who are potentially about to drop out of high school, training them up so that they can take high-paid tech sector STEM jobs without needing to afford college.
Right.
And there are 30,000 people, in the IBM program in New York City right now. So I guess what I'm saying is that it might be one of the ways to connect the fabulous soaring goals with some progress next year to involve some of the folks that are turbochargers, in this.
Thank you.
So very quickly, a couple thoughts on that, or responses. The first is that one of the things that we appreciated was that we had to begin with government, that we could not, as a commission, essentially dictate to the private sector what they could do and how they could do it. But the way that the proposals are structured, especially when we look at the Office of Racial Equity and appreciate that every city agency, every mayoral office has to look at their data and their indicators for how they're doing business and who they're doing business with. One of the considerations, one of the factors that will come into play is, who are we doing business with here in New York City? And, are the practices that are employed, is the relationship centering on equity and fairness. So that's one of the ways that we're coming at this. The other thing that we're appreciating is that as a society on the whole, we have to make sure that the pipeline is there to have sponsees. And so part of this work here again is making sure that we're not just moving young people of color, through social promotion or other methods that put them at a disadvantage. So we want to strengthen the education system accordingly. And thirdly, what I'll share with you is that we also have to appreciate that, that if New York City can become the model with all of us working together, it creates essentially, it's like a call to action on the part of the private sector to then engage accordingly. If we come on up and set different expectations, and we hopefully with that, not only look at, developing greater sponsorship, but also moving to DEI 2.0, because we've got way too many companies, too many corporations out there that center on, well, if we just get a person of color in a position of leadership, we've done something. And what we realize is that you are not asking when we sponsor, sometimes we have sponsorship and we get people of color into these leadership roles, they're not being invited to bring their whole selves to the table and to look at the structures and the systems that are in play within our corporations and companies that keep people at a disadvantage with respect to products and service offerings. So we've got to go the next level there too. And the hope is that this work could actually begin to get that that ball rolling. So thank you. Absolutely on point.
When I was in government, I always believed that the government can't ask folks to do what they're not doing themselves. And more often times than not, it has to take the first step. And then you bring other people along by example or by persuasion. Got the lady in the white sweater, the lady with the white glasses, and we're going to wrap up with Dr. Fuchs. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. I had a couple questions. One on the late. As we think about how this actually works and how the implementation works, what is the relationship between the culture of the agencies that are going to be developing new plans and then driving outcomes? How do we move from a sort of changing the phenotype of who's doing it, but the outcomes remaining the same, to actually getting to the point where the culture of the institutions start to shift in line with what the plans start to show up to look like? I know I'm just interested in how we start thinking about these questions of culture, which are so deep.
I feel like I'm answering every question. I'm sure people have their thoughts on this. I'll just quickly say that, one only need look to, what has resulted in the years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, Brown v. Board of Education, to appreciate that you can't legislate your way out of these problems only, that you have to affect change in values, attitudes, and beliefs. So again, that's why we begin with this preamble, trying to cast a vision that, as I think Khary put it so well, we have to hold ourselves as a city accountable to. One of the things that we talked about as a commission is, what does it look like? Does the Office of Racial Equity have to develop capacity building to reorient city government and city government players to appreciate, how bias and racism show up in our thinking and in our actions, and to reorient people accordingly? So there's a lot of work that has to be done there. The short of it is, we recognize it, we acknowledge the problem. The work only begins when we get these measures passed, if and when they passed. But that is an issue that is on the table. You've got to figure out how to change culture. And we believe with the racial equity plan, with the mayor being held accountable, even with city council being held accountable, that can begin, and if the city holds them accountable, that can begin to drive change.
So, and then as a comment on the private agency, of course, the executive board, and some of the parallel congressional action requires, of course, private companies to this, particularly under the Justice Board. So it feels like there's all kinds of opportunities to both use these same strategies through the sort of carrot as well as
And I think there's lots of opportunities to engage with private sector. I think it's important that, again, this preamble is starting with the government sector, the largest driver of the development of middle-class Black and Brown people in this city has been the public sector, has built civil service jobs, has been New York City government jobs for multiple generations. I push back and reject the idea that the private sector will lead on this. The private sector has been central to the problem, has been at the forefront of the problem, and has never been in the lead of diversification or of equity issues at all. It's usually been window dressing. You can look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and many corporations announcing efforts around Black Lives Matter and disappearing after 16 months, 18 months, 2 years. Because of course, racial equity has been achieved in the last 2 years. I think we missed the headline, but I guess that's their view. That doesn't mean there aren't leaders in the private sector who can play a role. It doesn't mean that there aren't institutions who can play a role. But if we're waiting for the private sector to drive equity and equality, I think we'll be waiting forever. And so what I think is central is that this is really done by the city of New York. This is 10 million people in the city. The city is majority Black and brown and Asian. The city is majority low and moderate income. If the majority of this city wants to ensure that this is an equitable city, whether it's through voting, whether it's through organizing, whether it's through movement building, whether it's demanding it from local elected officials, that's the only way we're going to have a city like is articulated in this preamble. It's not going to come top down. This is our city. And so the question is, what kind of city do we want to live in? I think there's a space for the private sector, but I certainly don't look to them to drive this at all. I think it has to be driven by government in certain ways, and then organizing, activism, litigation. That's the only thing that's ever driven change in this country, has been the intersection of litigation, organizing, and narrative change. That's the only thing that's ever driven change. The women's movement, civil rights movement, LGBTQ movement has never come from government, and it's never come from the private sector. I don't think this is any different. Hopefully we live in a time where the private sector won't be an albatross and won't stand in our way. That's a different issue, but I don't think it'll be driven from that sector.
Last.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Ma'am, you get the last question.
Thank you. My name is Monique Hardin-Cordero. I'm so glad to be here as a former SIPA student, so SIPA alum, and a current member of Community Board 9. I'm glad that Ken indicated that the guide is out, so I will look at the voter guide more closely. I have 2 questions. One, because I came late, so I apologize. I wanted to read a report. How is that report to be accessed? That's the first question. Second question, I think unless I missed this, I thought something was put out there in terms of what is the role of Columbia, or I guess I'm thinking, what role can Columbia University play in terms of helping address some of the issues that we were just mentioning, considering that Columbia is seen as a perpetrator of a lot of the inequities that we especially witnessed in this community. And being a former student and listening to people in the community, I hear this a great deal. This is a pivotal point in time that Columbia can help right or wrong and move it forward in terms of the many of the things that were mentioned. So I guess that's my question. Second question. Thank you.
Well, I can handle the first one. The Racial Justice Commission report can be found on nyc.gov/racialjustice. You can also read more about all the ballot proposals. You can see the legislation itself that would come into effect if the ballot measures pass.
Okay,
yeah.
/racial justice.
Thank you. Anyone want to take on the question regarding Columbia?
I figured that ended up over here. So I did not speak for Columbia University. I'm tremendously small fish in this large ocean of a university, but I think events like this evening, talking about these issues, educating ourselves, educating our own students, their active engagement and participation. They have their own power, if you will, and utilize it and speak out on a regular basis. We're in this particular school, your alma mater. Students have been very active, focused on issues of racial equity, diversity, the recent hiring of an associate dean for DEI, which absolutely positively was driven by the students here for numerous years. I mean, they passed that baton for a number of years to make things like that happen. We have not solved the problems of the universe, but I think as an educational institution, part of our primary role, especially a policy school, is to make sure that we're well informed and that we're not only talking the talk, but walking the walk at the same time. Thank you. Dr. Fuchs?
Thank you.
Oh, you need a mic.
Everybody knows I don't really need a mic, right? First of all, thank you everybody for coming. I think one of the things I want to say is it's so obvious that we need to pass these propositions. You know, when people say you don't have politics, if you're a political scientist, you're either lying or you're boring. So I think part of this discussion makes that clear. And I want to say from a academic point of view and from the point of view of how we teach public policy here, the most important thing I think that students should be taking away from this is really about the preamble and the aspirational goals. We've talked a lot in my class, at least some of you are here from my class, about how you set a policy agenda, right? How you get things on the political agenda. They don't just happen there. And of course, you know, what Khary said is important, that you need movements, you need action, you need the public engaged in some way. But putting this preamble into our, what is considered our Constitution, our New York City Charter, puts the issue of racial equity on the policy agenda. So it won't happen overnight. I mean, I was involved in a commission that looked at all the reports that the city is required to produce, and believe me, they don't produce them and they don't do the work they're supposed to do. So there's a lot of issues in terms of accountability of how you get this done, but that's up to us. And it's up, as all of you said. So I think this is, you know, an idea whose time has come maybe 100 years ago, right? At least. And the fact that we're getting here now and we're getting here in New York City, I think this will set a national standard, not just for cities, but for states and for the nation, because we're way behind in national policy on these kinds of issues, where so much more actually can be achieved. But we need to do it in the city. You know, the whole New Deal was originated basically in New York. So we can do that again here. And I just really want to thank this panel. This was just wonderful. Mayor Nutter, who came up from Philadelphia so he could moderate this panel this evening. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your just, you know, dedication to students at this university and to these issues that we believe are important. Thank you, Jennifer, Melanie, Khary, and of course, Ansa for participating tonight. There's a role for all of us here. Please thank this panel.
And I wanted to invite everybody. We really need to thank Dr. Fuchs.
No.
Because I just said, can we? She said, yes.
Little reception, but thanks for showing up. You didn't embarrass me tonight.